What were the reasons for the Japanese invasion of China in 1937? Sometimes known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, or to the rest of the world, the beginning of World War II. Well, if I want to strip away the discourse and really just understand what's going on here and the sort of hard-nosed geopolitical calculus, the the rising new central government of Chiang Kai-shek, led by his Nationalist Party government, which had relocated the capital from Beijing in the north to Nanjing in the south, is slowly trying to reunify the fallen pieces of the former Qing Empire. Okay, he's been trying to do this for about 10 years in 1937, ever since he established his new capital in 1927 at Nanjing. And he's slowly trying to chip away at the warlord autonomy throughout the provinces. Chiang Kai-shek's base of power is really only in the Yangtze River Basin, and trying, to reunify the country and reestablish central government Chinese authority throughout the former lands of the Qing Empire. Now, there has been significant success made over this 10-year period, an era known as the Nanjing Decade. Many of the other foreign imperialists who once had sweeping economic and political concessions in China have begun to roll back some of those, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes in the face of threats by the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party was very open in saying, we intend to roll back all imperialist privileges, take back sovereignty over our country. Things like extraterritoriality, foreigners can't be tried in Chinese courts, low tariffs, economic indemnities like the Boxer indemnity. We're going to take all this stuff back. It's just a matter of time. And most of the foreign empires that had interest in China realized that this was inevitable. This is the way things were going to go. Many of them started to actually reinvest funds from the Boxer indemnity back into China. And then pay lip service. Say, on paper, yes, we commit to rolling back extraterritoriality within X number of years and, giving sovereignty back to China once you've proven you can be a modern, responsible state. They had that discourse as well. But by 1937, Chiang Kai-shek has made significant progress. And the problem is that all the other foreign imperialists are Europeans and Americans. They have other political interests and colonies elsewhere in the world. If they get kicked out of China, if they have to give up some of their privileges in China, they have lots of other things to look after. The French have Indochina, the British have India, the Americans are in the Philippines and, many other Pacific islands in the Caribbean. All the other empires have other interests outside of China. Not Japan. Yes, Japan has a few other things, but it's all East Asia. It's all in the Chinese orbit, and the big prize was always China, especially Manchuria. Okay. Some of the other stuff, you could even say Korea, Taiwan. These are all sort of collateral damage from the Japanese effort to get onto the mainland, to take over China, or at least parts of China. Japan has nowhere else to go. In the face of finally a strong, rising new central government that's reconstituting the old Qing Empire under Chiang Kai-shek's tutelage, that's a major threat to Japan. Whatever the discourse is, whatever they say, Chiang Kai-shek's enthralled to foreign imperialists. Chiang Kai-shek isn't stopping communism. The real reason is Japan can't afford to give up China. That's it. That's what it comes down to. All the other empires can. They're not going to go to war over China. Japan will. Because if they withdraw from China, they lose everything. That's essentially what they need to have. They've already, before 1937, the Japanese have already cut off the Manchuria and turned it into a puppet state known as Manchukuo, the home of the Manchus. The idea here is they use the nation-state pretext to say we're engaged in a mission of nationalist liberation. This isn't for our own selfish imperial benefit. We're liberating Manchus, who were the rulers of the former Qing Empire, said they were hounded down and slaughtered by Chinese racism towards these guys after the 1911 revolution and fall of the last empire. Many of them retreated back to Manchuria. We found them, reconstituted them. We're going to give them their own state, free and safe from oppressive Chinese rule. This is all discursive fiction. Obviously, the Japanese want the natural resources, want to be able to send Japanese settlers to Manchukuo, but they have to do it on what is then seen as a legitimate pretext: nationalist liberation from oppressive domestic rulers. And then, of course, the Japanese are, they dominate all the advisory positions. No one can do anything in Manchukuo without Tokyo, or the Japanese advisors, at least, signing off on it. So Japan's already got northeastern Asia, Manchuria, in the guise of the Manchukuo puppet state. After this, it's almost inevitable that we're going to end up in a full-scale conflict because it sets in motion a series of events that's kind of like a snowball effect. The world economic depression at this time period pushes all countries into protectionist mode. Japanese leaders start to think, well, what happens if Western empires shut down access to their markets and we can't get American or British oil anymore? What if we can't get rubber from Southeast Asia? We're fatally dependent on this. And they're starting to realize in the 1930s just how dependent they were on access to Western markets and China, which is increasingly flexing its muscles and saying the Japanese have to get out, China for the Chinese. So what you start to see is this desire to bring things to a head with China. So far, Chiang Kai-shek doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to fight because he knows he can't win yet. But eventually, in 1937, the Japanese sort of provocations become too great. Chiang Kai-shek's in danger of losing his own support in China if he doesn't fight. And finally, in 1937, there's a series of provocations staged mostly by the Japanese, in which Chiang Kai-shek finally takes the bait, finally fights, much fiercer than the Japanese expect. And the Japanese take the fight down to Beijing and then down to Shanghai and Nanjing, the capital. And Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party simply flees inland to their wartime capital of Chongqing, bogging down Japan into a quagmire war. Now, the reasons for bringing the Western Allied powers into this war, originally it's just a second Sino-Japanese war. How did it become a world war? Well, we all know about Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. That was simply the first opening act of a very strategic mission to gain access to Southeast Asian raw materials. See, what you're worried about is the Anglo-American potential embargo and sanctions due to the war in China, due to Japan's actions in China, Manchukuo, and the fighting in Beijing and Shanghai and Nanjing. You've got increasing embargoes and sanctions, freezing of Japanese assets and international banks and whatnot. They're not going to fight Japan yet, but they're starting to put the pressure on Japan and say, hey, you're starting to come into conflict with our interests now. And the Japanese say, you know what, we see what's going to happen here. We need to act before the Anglo-Americans act and shut us out of world markets. We need access to those raw materials from Southeast Asia, which are currently under the control of the British and French and Dutch and American empires. Okay, so Pearl Harbor was really to sort of temporarily cripple and shock the Americans and sidetrack them so Japan could go and sort of have its own blitzkrieg lightning attack through Southeast Asia, which is exactly what they did. In a very short period of time, over 1941, they invade Malaysia, French Indochina, the Philippines, all of these sort of places in Southeast Asia. They get iron ore and tin and rubber from Malaysia, coal from French Indochina, oil, nickel, tin, rubber from Dutch Indonesia, tungsten from the Philippines, tin and rubber from Thailand, which remains independent but still has a coercive relationship with Japan during World War II as well. On top of all of this is a lofty discourse that Japan really starts to promulgate at this time period throughout the war, known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That's like any sort of military mission in our own days, Operation Enduring Freedom, that sort of stuff. It's just a really lofty sounding rhetorical gloss over a military campaign for your own selfish strategic interests. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is Japan basically telling everyone in Asia, we're liberating you. We're liberating you from Western white racist imperialism, and we're going to allow you to be masters of your own future under our temporary stewardship for a more prosperous modern Asia. Of course, it's just a Japanese empire. In fact, sometimes Japanese imperialism during World War II was worse than what the Westerners had done before, because the Japanese took over in war and they immediately had to harness and exploit the resources even greater than the Westerners had done before them in order to get what they needed to prosecute the war, because now the United States and Great Britain immediately declare war on Japan because of Pearl Harbor. So now you really have to exploit those newly gained colonies in the war far more than the Westerners before you had actually been doing. So doesn't take a very long time before most Asians have pretty negative impressions of Japan. Taiwan is going to remain pretty much the only place that Japan ever colonizes where there's some sort of popular historical memory towards Japan that's positive. that's positive. Even to this day, you can see this. It's not that Japan didn't do any. There's no bloodshed or coerciveness in Taiwan. It's just compared to everything else, it was seen as one of the more successful of Japan's colonies, and one of the few places today where Japanese leaders can expect fairly positive relationships with Taiwanese leaders at a sub-diplomatic level, whereas pretty much every other country in Japan has a historical memory that has predisposed them to basically view Japan with hostility and say, hey, what they did to us during the war, during the 1920s and 30s, was pretty bad. Sometimes even worse than what Russia, Britain, the United States, and they were all doing as well. Japan, many Japanese leaders knew, actually, they were kind of fatalistic about this. Defeat was really only a matter of time. Okay, you have your quagmire overland in China. Chiang Kai-shek's not going to give up. He's not going to cede, the war, even though he often takes tremendous losses. You have the combined hostility and armies of Britain, the United States, Australia. Russia has a non-aggression pact, but they'll break that eventually in 1945 as well. During the war, Japan commits multiple atrocities. No time to go into each one in detail here, but we have to at least note them. The comfort women, the Nanjing massacre, biological warfare, testing on live human subjects, Unit 731 in Manchukuo during the war as well. However, we want to finish here on one of the most important questions: why Japan surrendered. It's always been hotly debated. And if you're an American growing up in the United States, you've been fed one version of the story. If you grew up in Russia, you were probably fed a very different story. I want to bring in both perspectives here. Was it because of the atomic bomb? Was it because the United States dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Maybe, maybe not. We actually know scholars now have presented a more balanced view. The United States certainly wanted to peddle that view. It was because we dropped the bombs. We had to do this to save millions of Americans from dying in an invasion of the Japanese islands. The honest answer is we can't really know for certain if that was it, but it was the back-to-back impact of 2 things: the atomic bomb and the Russian declaration of war. The Russians had a non-aggression pact with Japan during the war. They declare war, I believe, 1 day after the first atomic bomb is dropped. It's almost a race between the United States. We all know Japan's going to lose by this point, August 1945. And both sides have their agenda. The United States wants to test not 1, but 2 atomic bombs. They have 1 plutonium and 1 uranium. They wanted to make sure they both worked. They wanted to make sure they tested both of them. The Russians wanted to make sure they got in on the kill. They were afraid the Japanese might surrender before they had a chance to declare war on them, and then Russia would have no pretext to occupy northeastern China, or to get in on North Korea, or perhaps the Japanese islands occupation. Both of them together, we know, were decisive. The Japanese leadership apparently was not inclined to surrender after the first atomic bomb. It seems as though maybe the Russian declaration of war may have been more decisive. They knew once the Russians declared war and commenced battle overland in Northeast Asia, that was it. But nevertheless, all these things combined certainly was decisive. Important to note, there is a cultural legacy of the atomic bomb in Japan. Dropping the atomic bomb, whether or not it was decisive in getting Japan to surrender, certainly helped the Japanese create a victimization narrative that said, we only lost the war because of the immoral scientific superiority of the United States. We didn't actually lose strategically. We were winning the war in China. The only reason we lost is because they have fewer scruples than us. They were willing to make this unbelievably inhumane weapon and drop it on a major city center and kill all these people instantly. And it allowed many people in Japan to see themselves as victims rather than aggressors during the war. The loss of the empire outside the home islands also made Japanese atrocities like the Nanjing massacre, Unit 731, comfort women seem very abstract. That happened somewhere far over the ocean, not here. And one of the great embodiments of this post-war victimization narrative is the film Godzilla. Most people think of it as an action film. Godzilla is the ultimate victimization post-war narrative in Japan, actually, in which a monster comes from the ocean in the east, i.e. the United States, created by a nuclear test, woken up by a nuclear bomb, and then ravages the home islands, just like the United States firebombing campaigns and the nuclear bombs did as well. Very much the sense many people are, if they're so inclined, and most people are inclined not to blame themselves for things, to adopt a victimization narrative, which is quite different than what you see in Germany. The atrocities in Germany happened in Germany, even without the colonies. The Germans will be forced, maybe not entirely, but more than the Japanese, to come to some sort of understanding of what happened in Germany that we or our parents may have been complicit in. It's not going to happen in Japan. All right. Also, lastly, think of the many different possible outcomes. If it wasn't for unconditional surrender, if Japan somehow had been able to organize something that wasn't so unconditional, there are many different alternatives for how the geopolitics of Asia could have turned out. Manchukuo could have turned out to be independent. That's what happened to Mongolia. They were just following the Soviet blueprint in Mongolia. The Soviets said the same thing. We're liberating Mongols from oppressive Chinese rule. Exactly the same thing. The only reason Mongolia exists as an independent state today and Manchukuo doesn't is because the Soviets were on the winning side of World War II. That is it. No other reason. If Japan didn't have unconditional surrender, Manchukuo perfectly, absolutely could have been an independent state. Yes, it seems fake and superficial and manufactured at the beginning. Time will change all that. You can naturalize these things, just like the idea of race. We can naturalize in our minds who the Yamato race is, even if it's a wildly definition than what it was before. Manchukuo could have been an independent state, not gone back to China. Taiwan, Sakhalin, Korea. There were all kinds of gray areas, middle grounds that could have occurred if Japan hadn't ultimately held out for unconditional surrender terms, and the victors basically said everything before 1895 is what Japan is, anything after 1895 is the empire, and we're going to reverse all of that right now.